weeks we have journeyed through the book of James in a series that is entitled The 8 Effects of Our Faith. Faith perseveres, faith obeys, faith loves, faith acts, faith speaks, faith submits, faith humbles. Today, briefly, we're going to look at the 8th effect of our faith, as that is that faith prays. The book of James, as you probably know, was written by James, the half-brother of Jesus. James was a doubter. Interesting that we look at a book and talk about faith when someone himself that wrote it originally was a doubter until the point of the resurrection. He became, however, after that, one of the most strategic pieces in the early church, along with Peter and John. He served as the pastor of the church, their first church there in Jerusalem. He had a nickname. He was known as James the Just because of his zeal and for obedience to God and his devotion to prayer. It was said that James's knees resembled those of camels because of the calluses that had formed on his knees because he spent so much time on his knees in prayer. So the man who wrote the very book we are studying literally bore the marks in his own body of his greatest weapon. You see, James knew that real faith prays. It prays to the point that it not only leaves a mark on your spirit, but also a mark on your body. In other words, its effect on your life changes your mind as it changes your actions. Again, going back to James's words, be doers, not just hearers. Doing, not just hearing. That's what the book of James is all about. Then why pray? Well, without prayer, I can guarantee you this. You will never pass the test of faith. James passed the test of faith, believing in this gospel he preached all the way to his death. James's death was a messy one. He was martyred, being thrown from the pinnacle of the temple, a fall which he survived. Then he was hauled up to the next level, the parapet, and thrown from there, once again surviving the fall, and was basically finished off with a club. He was beaten to death. And yet his faith stood the test. So in light of these 8 effects, perseverance, obedience, love, actions, our words, submission, humility, and prayer, I want us all today to take a few moments and put our faith to the test through the lens of this prayer warrior. And we're going to circle back to chapter 1, where James offers us 4 warnings about our faith. James says there are 4 questions that we should ask ourselves, or 4 items that we should consider when testing our faith. I'd like to invite you to join me as I read James chapter 1 and verses 9 through 18. We read these 7 weeks ago, but we're going to read them again, and we're going to look at them through a different lens. So James chapter 1, starting in verse 9. Believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position. But the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wildflower. For the sun rises with scorching heat and withers the plants. Its blossom falls, and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich will fade away, even while they go about their business. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, having stood the test. That person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all that he created. So there we go. 4 warnings about our faith that we should consider as we are putting our faith to the test. First of all, don't misplace your trust. All right? Back to verses 9 and 11, or rather 9 and 10. He talks about how money isn't everything. You know, money cannot buy happiness. Money cannot buy security. Money cannot buy health, okay? And he says that the poor man should be happy to be rich in spirit. But the rich man should understand how temporary his wealth is. Most all of us, at some point this year, those of us that have retirement plans, have taken a little bit of a bath earlier in the year, okay? Watch those numbers just dive down, okay? Now, fortunately, a lot of that has come back, but who knows what's going to happen, you know? And so we all have to realize that money is things that is one thing. Wealth is temporary, okay? Verse 11, he takes it further than that. He says, all things of earth are temporary and will fade away. And so we have to be careful about that in which we trust, okay? Now, it's interesting, too, about that. We have to be careful not to place our trust in something or in someone that is perishing. Every single one of us in this room, as hard as it is to think about this, we're all dying. All of us have an expiration date. One day it'll all be over. And so we have to be careful who we trust. You say, well, I trust my best friend, or I trust my spouse, or I trust my children, or whatever. Well, that's all well and good, but just know this, they're not going to be there forever. The one thing that's going to be here forever, the one person that we can place our trust in at all times, is Jesus Christ, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so it's very important that we not misplace our trust, okay? Now, on the flip side of that, we also have to realize that James talks about trials, okay? And sometimes we get in the middle of trials and we actually put our trust in circumstances, you know? We start looking at circumstances around us and we think, you know what? I'll never get out of this, okay? This storm will never pass, or I'm in trouble. I'm never going to be able to see things the same again. This is, they talk about this a lot in psychology. Never make a permanent decision during temporary circumstances. Well, I was in a situation a few years ago. In fact, I think it was like 2011. And it was my mother's birthday was coming up. Her birthday's in January. And so we had, I was living in Atlanta at the time, and the plan was we were going to come over and have dinner. And so the weather forecast was calling for a snowstorm to come in later that week. So we decided we'll celebrate her birthday early, and we were going to get together on a Sunday evening. Well, at the time also, my car had something wrong with it, and so my brother-in-law was fixing my car. They lived in Winder at the time. And so the plan was that we were all going to meet here in Athens at the Cracker Barrel on a Sunday evening and have dinner. Meanwhile, my brother-in-law was going to leave my car up at Bethlehem at all those shopping center areas. I think it was at the time there wasn't nearly as much up there, but the Target was there. And so I was going to grab my car on the way back into town, okay? Well, sure enough, now that was the day the storm was coming, at least, all right? And so, but Sundays are busy for pastors, right? So you don't have a whole lot of time to sit and do some whatever. So that morning, I pulled up the phone and looked, and the weather said that the storm was going to hit at midnight, okay? And I'll never forget, Mom called, should we not get together? Because, you know, I don't want you to get stuck in the storm. I said, no, it's fine. We'll be home by midnight. There's no sweat, okay? Well, the storm hit before midnight, okay? And in fact, when we got to Cracker Barrel, Jackie, my brother-in-law came up and said, and by this time it was like 6:30, he goes, you know, it's snowing in Noonan. And I look at my, cell phone clock, and I'm like, we haven't even sat down yet. No, I'm in trouble. Well, sure enough, we've had our meal, and so one of my friends came with me because I had to drive a separate car back, and so we took off, and we got to Target. I got my car. He's in the car behind me. Here we go. We get to the intersection of 316 and 85 right there, I guess Duluth and Norcross, wherever that is, and the first flake came. I thought we might make it, Terry. By the time we got to Spaghetti Junction, which is about 10 miles from there, it was just a whiteout. I mean, it's flakes the size of silver dollars. You can't see anything. And I'm like, boy, this is not good. Well, if I might add this, my cell phone was dead. And I had no battery, no charger. Well, unbeknownst to me, Mom and Dad are at home on their TVs watching Atlanta melt down on Sunday night. There's MARTA buses dangling off bridges. I mean, it's bad, okay? I've got the radio on. We're headed into town. It's just coming down in buckets. I'm talking, it was like, we got like 3 inches in the first hour. And so we're going, and we're going 30 miles an hour and 20 miles an hour. And so finally, you know, those big signs on the interstate, it says the interstate is closed. You know that big long overpass there that goes over the rail, the MARTA rails? It's like a mile long. That thing froze over, and there were like one MARTA bus was turned over somehow. The other one was dangling off the edge. And they just closed down the bridge. Now, I'm about 15 minutes on a regular night, a regular day from my house here, okay? So we had to get off this interstate there. And so we got off, and even with getting off and whatever, still only about 20 minutes from home, okay? That 20 minutes turned into 2 hours, all right? 2 hours. At one point, we pulled over at a gas station, and I went in and bought a charger and started charging my phone. And, of course, you know, it got up just enough so I could make a call. And I called the house, and Mom's like, "Sugar, you okay?" I was like, "Mom, I'm fine. We're having a great time here. You know, I mean, this is just, it's so fun. You know, we're driving in the snow." And, you know, I lived in Kentucky for 6 years. And one time we had 2 feet of snow there. And one thing I learned is when you're driving in snow, don't stop. You've got to keep moving. No matter how pitiful the young widow with 17 kids in her van looks on the side of the road. The reason she's on the side of the road is she stopped. You've got to keep moving. And so I told my friend behind me, I said, "We got to keep moving. We got to keep moving. We got to keep moving." Well, there were times in that perilous 2 hours, Wanda, when I thought, you know what? I'm never going to get out of this. And it was one of those storms. Y'all probably remember we ended up getting about 7 or 8 inches out of it. And then a cold snap came. And the kids missed school the whole week, and the snow was just everywhere. It took like a week to melt. And I just remember thinking, Jackie, wow, I'll never get out of this situation. But you know what? Eventually, I got home that night. And sure enough, the next day, it was this winter wonderland, and it was cold. I don't think it got out of the 20s, and it was just so hard, you know, it was frozen and so beautiful. But you know what happened? About 3 or 4 days later, the sun came out, and slowly but surely, the snow melted away. And I got out of the situation, and life went back to normal. And I thought, you know what? That's a great example sometimes. So we get in the middle of a storm. We think, you know what? This is never going to end. And so then we start, again, trusting in temporary things. We start putting our trust, well, I got to, you know, that night it was if I could just get my phone charged, I'd be okay, you know. Or if I could just get home. And it's easy in those times to take our eyes off of the one thing that we can trust in more than anything, and that is God. Don't misplace your trust. Second warning, don't misperceive your trials. You know, verse 12, we need to understand that we have an incredible friend in life. That's Jesus Christ, okay? He loves us. He desires to take care of us. He desires to have a relationship with us, okay? But we also have a terrible and formidable enemy, Satan, okay? He hates you. He doesn't want to just bother you. The Bible says he wants to destroy you. He's like a roaring lion. He wants to obliterate you. He will try and make you think that he's there to help you. But the truth of the matter is he wants to destroy you. Now, through it all, James reminds us, trials are going to come. All right? I heard somebody say one time, with respect to trials, you're either in the midst of one of 3 situations. You're either in the middle of a trial, you just got finished with one, or you're about to go into another. Okay? It's like my friend that lives in Southwest Florida, Fort Myers. He says we have 4 seasons: early summer, midsummer, late summer, and next summer. Right? Well, that's how it is with trials. You're either in one, you're finishing up one, or you're starting a new one. Okay? They're going to come. In fact, James says, by the way, that approval, God's approval, is found in enduring trials, not avoiding them. Now, some people, some pastors, some TV preachers, they preach, hey, you can avoid trials if you'll just trust God. He'll make everything good for you. Well, I don't read that in James. I don't see that at all. Okay? And Jesus allows us to experience the trials, just as he did James, in order to make us stronger. Sometimes when we're going through trials, it's easy to misperceive. It's easy to say, you know what? I'm having a rough time here, okay? God has forgotten about me. God is just sitting up in heaven laughing at me right now. He's putting me through this trial, and I'm having a hard time. But we have to understand that it is a mistake to misperceive our trials, okay? So don't misplace your trust. Don't misperceive your trials. Number 3, don't be misled by temptation. Now this verse here is one of those ones that people famously misquote, okay? And famously don't understand. How many times have you heard someone innocently say, well, God will never put on you more than you can handle, right? That is theological malarkey, all right? That is one of the most untrue, yet often quoted passages of Scripture. And they're thinking about this. Never say God will tempt you and he won't let anything come on you that you can't have an escape from temptation. Okay? What do you think James was thinking after he hit the ground and he fell off the pinnacle of the temple and he survived, and it's like, hey, let's throw him off again? You think that was more than he could handle? Probably. Okay? And then when he survived the second fall and they all picked up baseball bats to finish him off, was James living his best life now? That's not the way it works. But here's the thing. It is important to understand God does not tempt us, but he does test us. Okay? And the end result of tests helps us in our process of sanctification. Now, temptation comes from the enemy. Its end forces us down a road that ends in sin. Notice verse 14 again, and the process that sin takes in your life. In fact, I put a little formula up on the screen, okay? There are 3, the road to sin, I guess, has 3 mile markers. First of all, it's the bait, okay? He says each of us, when he is, let's see, where did it go? It says, but each person is tempted, okay, when they are dragged away by their own evil desire. Okay, well, first of all, dragged away. Okay, that's temptation. All right, so that's the bait. Then the bite. He says, by his own evil desire and enticed. Okay, some people say, well, I've never been tempted by so-and-so. Well, that's because you don't have the desire. Okay, I've never been tempted to jump out of an airplane, Sharon. I know you did a couple of weeks ago. That was fun, huh? Did you enjoy that? You'll ever do it again? Yeah, okay. I have never once in my life been tempted to jump out of an airplane. I just have no desire. In fact, I'd rather have a root canal with no anesthesia, personally. I mean, if I could just say. And so I don't walk around saying, boy, I have so much more self-control than Sharon Cherry because I don't jump out of airplanes. Well, that is because I have no desire to. And sometimes we can get a little hyper-spiritual, Senor Griffiths, and say, hey, I don't struggle with those same things that Jackie struggles with. Why, she needs to get her act together, all right? Well, you know what? The bottom line is temptation could disappear off the face of the earth tomorrow, and we'd still keep sinning. Because we don't need temptation to sin. We already have the desire in our own heart, okay? And that's the bite. The bait is temptation. The bite is desire. And then here comes the birth of sin. Now, Jesus lacked a major ingredient for sin. Okay? Oftentimes I thought, well, I wonder how close Jesus really came to sinning in the desert that day when he was tempted. Never came close. Why? Because he lacked the number one thing, okay? He lacked the desire to sin. Now, why is that? Because he was such a good guy? No, because he was Spirit-filled. Okay, John 14:30 says that. Temptation is when desire meets with opportunity. I remember, well, I don't remember, it was before I was born, but I've read Vince Lombardi, the great Hall of Fame Packers coach, used to say that luck is when preparation meets with opportunity. And that's exactly the situation with temptation. It is when desire meets with opportunity. Now, it's interesting to observe the differences in the progression of sin versus Spirit-filled, okay? I put a little formula up on the board, another one here. And this is Jesus, okay? The difference between faith and desire. Faith begins with trials that test, okay? The same way Jesus was tested, okay? And that results in perseverance, you know? He says, then after desire, said, but don't be deceived. Every good, perfect gift comes from above. We need to persevere through our temptations, through our trials that test. And that the end result is maturity. On the other hand, desire begins with temptation. And that temptation many times leads to sin. And sin always leads to death. So you want to put your faith to the test this morning? Don't misplace your trust. Don't misperceive your trials. Don't be misled by temptation. Look, you can put your trust in Jesus. You can trust in the right things. Okay? You can have a proper perspective on the trials in which you're undergoing. But you can run the train off the tracks right here with temptation. Okay? Number 4. Don't be mistaken about the truth. Verse 17. Every good and perfect gift comes from God. Remember when we talked about this about 7 weeks ago? I talked about the shadows, and remember the parking lot shadows and how slender you look in the parking lot, you know, when the sun is shining at an angle just perfectly or whatever. Well, there are no shadows with God, okay? There are no tricks. Jesus is the ultimate place for our faith to be invested, okay? Because he's not going to trick you. He's not going to make things seem one way when they're another way. That's Satan's game, okay? So here's the thing. You say, well, then how is it possible, Rusty, to discern which is which? You know, how can I discern a shadow from the real thing? Well, that's a fair question. But if it comes from God, I'll tell you this. You could tell pretty fast if you put things that come in your life through the 3 tests I'm about to tell you about, you'll be able to tell pretty fast if it's coming from God or if it's coming from Satan. How do we know the difference? Well, first of all, we need to put it to the morality test. Very simple question. Is this or does this cause me to sin? Simple. Say, well, hey, God's brought this opportunity in my life to go do this. Well, okay. The very first thing you need to ask yourself, number 1, is this a sin? Number 2, could this possibly cause me to sin? Now look, there are a lot of things in our lives that don't pass that test, right? You know, I mean, honestly, let's just be serious, okay? And we tend to, many times with a blind eye, overlook some of those things, okay? A lot of those things. And a lot of things in our life, your life and my life, if we really took a hard look at it, would fail the morality test. And so we can know right off the bat, Jesus is not going to tempt us. He's not going to put something in your life specifically to try and make you fail the morality test, okay? Jesus doesn't want to create sanctified, immoral people. He wants to create sanctified, moral people, people that love him. So if it comes from God, it has to first of all pass the morality test. Is it sin, okay? Or does it cause me to sin? Secondly, the maturity test. Boy, this takes the bar a little higher, okay? The first one is, well, does it cause me to sin? All right? The second one is, well, is it part of making me closer to the Lord? Okay? Is it part of my sanctification? And then if that bar is not high enough, try this one on. This one's like up there with the lights, okay? The maker test. Is it consistent with the character of God the purposes of God, and the Word of God. When a situation comes into your life, if it passes these three tests, it's from God. If it doesn't pass these three tests, you better be very careful with it, because it's likely not from God. Don't mistake what is false for the truth. Now, you might be here this morning and say, whew, I'm failing this test. All right? Well, there's good news today. On past failures, you could turn the page. Are you aware that one of the biggest faith failures in the Bible was the very guy who wrote this book? James, the brother of Jesus. You know, he didn't even become a true believer in Jesus. After he had seen Jesus raise people from the dead, heal people, turn water into wine. He'd seen all these things firsthand, and yet he didn't believe until after the resurrection. What a failure, an utter failure of faith. But yet God used him anyway. And he can use you regardless of past failures. You might be sitting there today saying, Pastor, I have just messed up so many times. I have just messed up my life beyond repair. Well, part of that may be true. You might have messed up your life. But it is not beyond repair. James was a faith failure. And yet, we look to him today as the example for how to test our faith, to put our faith for the test. So here's a question. Is your faith today strong enough to save your soul? I pray that it is. Okay? And if it is, then it needs to pass these tests of these 4 questions. Okay? Furthermore, if your faith is strong enough to save your soul, then it should affect your life. It should have some effects on your life. 8 effects, in fact. First of all, it must cause you to persevere through life's trials and temptations. Now, that doesn't mean we make it through all of them, okay? But it is our on-ramp to relief. It is what helps us to persevere. Your faith should cause you to persevere. Secondly, your faith should cause you to obey. Remember, we talked about your attention and your attitude and your actions, those 3 areas about obedience. Well, if your faith is strong enough to save your soul, it ought to be strong enough. You ought to be having some victory in your life when it comes to obedience. Your faith must cause you to love without favoritism. In other words, loving someone, investing in someone that has no possible means to give you anything in return. That's true love. Your faith must cause you to act. It should be a dynamic faith, not a dead faith or a demonic faith. Your faith should cause you to speak life. Your faith should cause you to submit to godly relationships and godly wisdom. Your faith should cause you to humble yourself before God. Your faith should cause you to pray. You know, Jim Elliot once said, we've all heard this statement, but it bears repeating. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose. One day you're going to give your life. Death is inevitable for every last one of us. It is just as inevitable for the children that sat on this floor a few moments ago as it is for those of us here who are in our 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. One day you're going to give your life. And the question is, will your faith have stood the test of time? Would you pray with me? Lord, I ask you today that you would move in a mighty way in this room. Lord, I pray that every single person here right now in this moment would hold up that mirror, that faith mirror, Lord, and take a look at our hearts and our lives honestly and fully. Lord, I pray that if there is an unrighteous or an unpleasing way or manner or attitude in our hearts, Lord, I pray that you would give us the strength right now, Lord, to turn over whatever that is to you. Lord, if it's a sin, to confess it. If it's an attitude, Lord, to to get rid of it. If it's unforgiveness, Lord, to seek forgiveness. Father, if there's someone here today that's never said, you know what, I don't know about this whole faith